Well, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to have been invited to participate in this very timely forum on climate change, and I'd like to thank Erik for his perspective. I'd also like to thank the Swedish Presidency, and particularly my counterpart Andreas Carlgren for all of his hard work, and it has been hard work indeed. Connie from Denmark has done tremendous. Can you hear me? Sorry, I beg your pardon. Yeah. Okay. If you didn't hear me, I was simply saying that I'm delighted to be here this morning, and I was thanking Erik for his own perspective and thanking particularly the Swedish Presidency and my counterpart Andreas Carlgren for his work, and of course the Danes too for the tremendous work that they have done over the last number of months. Now, in gathering my own thoughts on my contribution, and I know I'm under time pressure here because the chairperson has quite rightly said that he wants an interactive conference, and I want to facilitate that. But I asked myself the very simple question: what is at stake in Copenhagen? Now, yesterday evening, and I see some familiar faces here in the audience, I addressed a gathering here in the Westbury Hotel. It was organised by Self-Help Africa to launch a new publication entitled Climate Frontline, and it was a report that allows the voices of ordinary men and women in vulnerable African communities to be heard directly. The subject is adaptation, but the context, of course, is climate change, and it was, I felt, very powerful. And I understand that this morning you also had a very powerful story from Christian Dominguez Noko about the reality of adaptation in many of the communities in Southern America. And as Paul quite rightly said, we see the realities of climate change on our own doorstep, and I'm trying to deal with those sincerely this morning. And it is a very, very difficult situation, no question. And people don't have access. For example, now we know in Cork there are difficulties in relation to access to clean drinking water. Well, as bad as it is here for us, it is much, much worse for communities in Africa, and we know that. And that is why, and I'll be addressing this in just a few moments, the whole question of finance is such a priority. The Irish government has consistently and fully supported EU proactivity and leadership on the international response to climate change. That position is underpinned by the strength of the scientific advice on the potential impact of climate change and the urgency of a comprehensive and effective global response. And that's why, since entering government, we've set up a Cabinet committee chaired by the Taoiseach on climate change and energy security. We also have an Oireachtas committee chaired by a member of the opposition dealing with the issue of climate change. We've introduced a carbon budget, and this year for the first time we are introducing a carbon levy, putting a price on carbon, and this is by far and away the most effective way of decarbonising our economy, if you like. And for the first time ever as well, in 2010 we will have a climate change bill setting out targets and basically setting out a roadmap of how we're going to achieve those targets. Now, I know that there are people who believe that in view of the economic downturn that action on climate change should be deferred or given a lower priority in the shorter term. I believe that these views are both misguided and damaging. It would be, in my view, a major economic mistake, not to mention the social and environmental consequences, to pursue economic recovery at any cost. Again, if you look at just what Erik was saying there about green procurement, I think this is a priority. Again, in the upcoming budget, we're looking at ways of ensuring that, first of all, we have a very good retrofitting programme, which is, in my view, cost effective. It is labour intensive, and it also has the effect of reducing CO2 emissions and deals with the whole fuel poverty issue, particularly in the context of the forthcoming carbon levy. As part of the UNFCCC process, the penultimate round of the negotiations in advance of COP15 were held in Barcelona recently. At the end of that round, the EU restated its firm commitment to reaching a comprehensive, fair and legally binding treaty in Copenhagen. Part of the reason for restating its position was in response to the news which had emerged in the course of the session on the changed outlook for the Copenhagen conference. We now know that a new fully fledged treaty is unlikely to be achieved in Copenhagen, essentially in spite of the clear commitment by the parties at the conference in Bali in 2007 to finalise a new treaty in 2009. I think we have run out of time to complete the task in Copenhagen. And as I said last night, we have to now look at where we can complete that task. Is it realistically going to be in Bonn or in Mexico? I believe we are now looking at the possibility of a politically binding agreement rather than a legally binding treaty. It is disappointing, and in my view, it flies in the face of the fact that we are all too quickly approaching a point where the impact of climate change will become significantly more challenging and cost a lot more to address. We must never overlook the fact that for some of the developing countries, every day lost in terms of mobilising an effective global response to climate change increases the threat to their very survival as rising sea levels invade and engulf their land. Responding to this setback for the international process, the European Commission has said, and I quote, "The minimum outcome in Copenhagen must be a framework agreement on the essential building blocks of the new treaty and a deadline," which is most important, a deadline for completing it. My immediate reaction, in addition to my personal disappointment, is that the framework agreement will have to be convincing on the commitment of all parties, and the time framework for finalising the treaty will have to be short. An EU presidency perspective on Copenhagen has been given to us, and I don't want to go back over that, but I do want to address two important policy issues in the final preparations for the 15th Conference of the Parties. First, on our commitment to the Kyoto Protocol, and the second issue I want to address is on climate finance. In signing up to the Kyoto Protocol, we all recognise that this was only a first step, and a relatively modest step at that, in the longer term objective of mobilising an effective global response to climate change. That fact became, I think, increasingly evident as we began to deliberate on the objectives for a shared vision around which to build a fair and comprehensive global plan of action. In other words, when we began to contemplate the level of emission reductions that will be required by 2050 if we are to achieve the ultimate objective of stabilising greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a safe level. Indeed, what you have outlined, Erik, is exactly what the scientific evidence is, and in our conclusions as environment ministers, we recognise that in our conclusions. And I'll just talk about that at the very end of my contribution here. While Kyoto was undoubtedly a first step, it was, I believe, an important first step for many reasons. One of the most important, but least recognised, is the fact that the protocol established a robust international framework to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And when we talk about an instrument to ensure effective action, the protocol, I think, ticks all of the right boxes on key issues such as transparency and certainty, legally binding targets, compliance requirements, and flexible mechanisms. Its scope may have been limited, and the support which it received was certainly disappointing, but these are shortcomings that can be rectified. The key issue is that the Kyoto Protocol established, I think, a solid foundation for effective action by developed countries to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. It has been stated by some that the European Union is somehow trying to undermine the Kyoto Protocol. That is simply not true. I believe this situation arises from the fact that the EU preference for the post-2012 commitment period is a single legally binding instrument under the Convention, a single instrument that would enhance implementation and ensure consistency in the application of the post-2012 international climate change regime. In other words, a new protocol that builds on the Kyoto Protocol and incorporates its fundamental structure. The EU objective is to broaden the scope and effectiveness of the international response to climate change in the post-2012 period. Moving very quickly on, because Paul is looking at me here, on climate finance. A new treaty to succeed the Kyoto Protocol simply will not happen. It won't happen unless it includes a comprehensive financial package to assist developing countries in key areas such as capacity building, mitigation, adaptation, technology and protection of their forests. Based on figures developed by the European Commission, the Council has strengthened the focus in the international negotiations on finance by setting out EU estimates of short and long-term needs. In summary, the cost of mitigation and adaptation action in developing countries could amount to around €100 billion annually by 2020. Of that amount, the international public support element could be in the range of 20 to 50 billion annually. One point, ladies and gentlemen, I do want to make absolutely clear is that I see the international climate change agenda and the Millennium Development Goals as parallel priorities. They are not competing priorities, and any suggestion to that effect is entirely unacceptable. I'm pleased that in addressing the issue of climate finance, the European Council clearly signalled the need for a gradual but significant increase in additional public and private financial flows to help developing countries. Equally important is the clarification by the Council that such financing should not undermine or jeopardise the fight against poverty and continued progress towards the Millennium Development Goals. And as I said last night, and I'll be saying it again on Monday, I want to see 100% separation between ODA and adaptation finance. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not sure exactly, nobody does, what the outcome of the 15th Conference of the Parties in Copenhagen will be. I attended COP1 in Berlin, and I addressed that conference, and I addressed it full of confidence, and I really believed that we were on the cusp of something big. It didn't happen, and it is deeply frustrating as someone who has campaigned against climate change for over 20 years to see that we continually procrastinate. But what we have to understand is this, that this is an unprecedented endeavour. It is difficult enough when you have 27 member states gathered round a table to get agreement amongst them. To get agreement amongst the global community is extremely difficult. We know that. Each country has its own priorities, and there is a lot of special pleading, and none of us are exempted. You know, we all do it. In the case of Ireland, we have very important issues relating to agriculture, and you all are aware of that. But the science is very clear, and while I am a realist and I understand as a politician, as I said again repeatedly, the realities and the exigencies of politics, and I understand the difficulties, for example, that Barack Obama is experiencing at the moment. Equally, I know that you cannot defy the iron rules of science, and that the amount of CO2 being emitted is increasing all of the time. We have to reduce substantially, and I believe, and this is one of the things that is important in the conclusions that we reached as environment ministers, that the science is telling us all of the time to update, and that we realise now that the window of opportunity is closing all of the time, so that when we talk about 50% reduction by 2050, I think perhaps that is even in itself quite conservative. I believe that we're going to have to be much more ambitious, and we will hopefully reach a deal, as I said, the sooner the better, probably realistically in Mexico. But that deal in itself, ladies and gentlemen, won't be going far enough. That's the reality. And so we have a lot of work to do, all of us together, and I want to thank each and every one of you for coming along to today's event. I hope that we will get a long part of the road in Copenhagen, and certainly for my part and for the government's part, we'll be doing everything we can to ensure that becomes a reality. Thank you very much.